Hi there, my name is James and I'm working with AV3 software to bring you an Element 3D tutorial. AV3 offers great discounts on visual effects and motion graphics plugins from some of the best plugin creators in the industry. Visit av3software.com and have a look for yourself. Welcome to part 2. Today we're going to be looking at ways to improve our scene using lighting and effects. So first off, we're going to create a new solid. I'm going to name it Glow. Using the Optical Flares plugin from Video Copilot, this will serve as the engine glow at the back of our ship. So apply Optical Flares, and make sure that the source type is Track Lights. Check Disable 3D Perspective, but uncheck everything else. Then go to Name Starts With, and go to E. And if you remember the light that we named Engine in the first part, Optical Flares should track onto that light. Let's change the render mode to add, or you can change it to screen or something else if you prefer. So let's tweak the way this glow looks. Click Clear All. Let's just create a very simple sort of glow effect. Let's make it a nice blue, and that'll do. Let's tweak the brightness and scale a little bit. Looks pretty good. However, I'm sure you can already see the problem. Now there are lots of ways to fix this, but the simplest way is just to simply keyframe the brightness or the opacity. So we'll do it when the engine glow should disappear. We'll do it again when the engine glow should reappear. Which is probably about here. That looks okay. So now let's start thinking about getting a better sense of depth and speed. Create a new solid called Dust. And we're going to use Trapcode Particular to simulate that dust. So apply the effect. Change the emitter type to Lights. And let's go to Options at the top. And change Name Starts With to Particle. And that will allow the light that we named Particle in the first part to serve as the emitter. Be sure to change the modifier to None, because otherwise you might not see any particles at all. Then go to Emission Extras and change the pre-run particles to 100, just so we can see what we're working with. Let's increase the emitter size to simulate a large debris field. And let's actually bring the pre-run particles down to 10. And you can probably see how it's starting to shape up. So let's edit the particles themselves. Change the velocity to 0 because we don't need anything to be moving. Let's change the life to just 1 second. Give opacity over life a nice smooth curve. And you can see the particles pop in just a little bit less suddenly. However, particles that should be behind the ship are rendered on top of the ship. So let's use Element 3D's Z Depth feature to fix this. First, let's duplicate our composition. And then in our new composition, we're going to get rid of all the layers we don't need. This includes the effects layers, the light layers, and our space background layers. So then let's go to Scene, go to Group 2, and let's disable Group 2 so that we only render the ship. And then let's go to Output and change the output to Z Depth, and then edit the values below. The goal is to make our ship white and the background black. The closer an object is to the camera, the whiter it is. So you can see a sort of depth gradient along the ship. Once you got something that looks more or less like this, rename the new composition for clarity. I've just called it Z. And then let's go back to our original composition and drag Z in. Now ordinarily you'd want to link cameras and keyframes across compositions, because this means that any changes made in your original composition will be reflected in the new one. But for the sake of brevity, and because I don't intend to make any more changes to the movement, I'll just be doing it like this. But just bear in mind that it's better to link across compositions. So let's go back to our dust layer. Go to visibility. And use our new Z composition as the Z buffer layer. And then you want to play with the values until you get something that looks about right. You might find that making your particles more visible, like I've done here, will make it a bit easier to adjust your Z buffer values. So that looks about right to me. Particles that should be in front are in front, and particles that should be behind are behind. So now let's edit the look of the particles themselves. Let's change the particle type to cloudlet, change the size to 1, the opacity to 50, with the goal of making it look like little rocks or bits of debris. Let's play around with the size randomness. And let's also change the color to a sort of rocky grey brown. And that's okay. Let's go to rendering, down to motion blur, and change it from composition settings to just on. Let's change the shutter angle to 180. You may also want to play around with boost opacity. And that looks pretty good. So now let's duplicate our dust layer, and let's make a slightly different particle. Greatly increase the size. Change the color to a pale blue. And let's also greatly decrease the opacity. And we'll also change the random seed. And now our ship is moving through a dust cloud. That adds a little bit more depth and density to our original particle effects. Now let's think about lighting our scene. Make a new light, make it a parallel light, and let's change the color to sort of pale yellow. I'm going to set the intensity to 200 and make sure that cast shadows is checked. And let's name this light B Sun, because optical flares is going to come into the equation again. Now because this is a parallel light, we don't need to place it very far away. So let's put it over on the left side of the ship. Let's also raise it up a little bit. Then go to the scene layer and change your render output to preview if it isn't already. And then we can see how our lighting looks. Now this alone makes it look a lot better. Whether you're on set or you're working with a 3D digital environment, lighting is incredibly important. Let's make a few more changes. I'm going to angle the light down a little bit more, just so we can get a bit more light into the scene. And I'm pretty happy with that. Now next, same as before, we want to create another null object. And for this I'm just going to duplicate camera control. Get rid of all the rotation keyframes. And I'm going to rename this null object Light Track. Just be sure it's got the position expression. And all we're going to do is parent bSun to Light Track. And this is important because of the way we're going to be rendering our shadows. Let's go to our scene layer, go to Render Settings, drop down to Shadows, and enable Shadows. Element 3D can render two kinds of shadows, shadow mapping and ray trace. I prefer the way that shadow mapping looks, but it does come with a few limitations. The biggest one being that it can only render shadows within a small radius. So parenting our light with the ship ensures that the ship always remains within that shadow render radius. So let's go down to Parallel Light, and let's crank up the shadow size. Let's also increase the map size, and turn up the shadow samples. Now it looks pretty good, but as you can see, an ugly shadow is being cast across the asteroids as we get closer to them. So to fix this, all we're going to do is make it so that the asteroids cannot receive shadows, but they can still cast them. And as you can see, it doesn't harm the way our scene looks, and it just means we don't have any distracting shadow effects. And the fact that these asteroids still cast shadows gives the impression that they still exist in the scene. Let's talk about shadow darkness. Completely black shadows means that we lose a lot of definition. Let's create another light. Let's make it an ambient light. Let's make it a pale grey-blue color. The intensity only needs to be about 5%. Now we can create the sun effect. Let's create a new solid. Name it Sun Glow. Let's apply optical flares to that layer. And as we did before, we're going to change the source type to track lights. Check Disable 3D Perspective and uncheck everything else. Then go to Name Starts with B for bSun. Then we're going to change the way our sun looks. You can add lens orbs and things like that, but I'm happy just to have it glow. And be sure to change the sun to an appropriate color as well. Let's play around with the brightness and the scale. That looks pretty nice. Now what you could do is just have the sun right there in frame, but I find that effect a little bit obnoxious, so keeping it just off frame is a pretty nice effect. So now that we've got the core of the scene looking a bit better, let's make a few changes to the background as well. In our space composition, I'm just going to very quickly make a planet out of shape layers. Then I'm going to position the planet so we can see it in frame, and make it look like maybe the ship is flying towards the planet. That looks okay. So now using images of an asteroid field that I just found online, I'm going to extend the asteroid field out. I'm going to create a new solid, make it a grey-blue, and just call it Fog. Using tint, we can use the same color to add a bit of depth to our asteroid field. And then we'll change our blue fog layer to an opacity of about 50%. And and that looks alright. Then at the very end, I'm going to change the opacity of our fog layer to 100%, then isolate our space layer so that it's all that we can see. So then in our scene layer, under render settings, go down to fog, change the fog color to that same pale blue, and enable fog, and then unhide our scene layer. So let's play around with the fog settings, mostly playing around with the fog range. And all we want to do is get a really good sense of depth, because as I said before, depth is very important in this kind of scene. So bring the fog and our space background composition back down to 50%. And there we have it. We've added some more depth and a better sense of scale to our scene. As a finishing touch, let's add some motion blur. So let's go down to render settings, go to motion blur, set motion blur to on. Let's increase the samples, something like 12 should be fine. And a shutter angle of 180 should also be fine. And be sure to do the same for our background layer as well. Now be sure to set your render mode to full render rather than draft or preview, and then we can get a proper idea of how it's going to look. And there we go. Now, as I said at the start of the tutorial, this is by no means supposed to be comprehensive. There is so much more you can do to this scene. You can maybe add some turbulence to the camera or the ship through a wiggle expression. You could add more particles, you could maybe animate the space layer to, I don't know, have a swirling nebula or a space battle or something like that going on. You could add a heat haze effect to the back of the engine. Now this only scratches the surface, but I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope you learned something. And be sure to check out av3software.com for great deals on After Effects plugins and other motion graphics and VFX software.